through December. We went, group from Arlington High School went, and it was terrific. I mean, definitely worth seeing. So hopefully the talk that he gives tonight will whet your appetite, and you guys will come and visit the library as well. One housekeeping thing. I know we always mention the calendars that the bank produces. If anyone is interested in a calendar and they haven't been in the bank to pick one up, it's a great keepsake. Jonathan over there? Jonathan over there, right, in the flannel. He has calendars if you're interested. Students in the back, if you want a calendar, right? Kids love calendars. All right, so I'll turn it over to you. Thanks, John.
Well, thank you. Hopefully you'll leave here wanting to see the exhibit, not wanting to see the exhibit, right? So that'll be the goal. And it's funny, I was just reading this paper here, and I happened to notice, oh look, there's an article right here about FDR to host President's Day weekend events. So if you're looking for something to do this President's weekend, which is coming up, come on down. We're going to have an exhibit of presidential signatures. President Roosevelt has dozens of signatures from presidents throughout history that he collected over time, and we have them in our collection, and we're going to have them on display just this weekend. So if you're interested in coming out, you can take a peek at that. And we have one particular really super cool book, which is it's While England Slept, which is John F. Kennedy's Harvard dissertation that he wrote to the president. He sent a copy to the president and said, oh, you're the president, blah, 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 John F. Kennedy. And then FDR had a habit of always writing his name in the book. So it's like a book with two presidential signatures, separated by, 40 or 50 years or so. So if you have some time, come on down. And of course, you're going to want to see the exhibit. The President's Day stuff you're going to want to see this weekend because it's only going to be out this weekend. But the Civil Rights exhibit, as Robert said, will be up until the end of the year. So I'm delighted to be here after all these years. I do a lot of these talks virtually. So if you see me going like this, it's only because that's how I'm used to seeing people lately in little squares. But I'm so happy the pandemic is over so we can actually get together and chat. So you'll notice I don't have a projector or anything like that. I do it old school, good old-fashioned storytelling. I do have some pictures that I brought with me that I'll pass around so folks can take a look at that. The only rule is that however many pictures go out, come back. Okay. If you want copies, we could probably get you some. But you can do this talk other places and such, so it's helpful if we've got this. So we have a temporary gallery in our exhibit, in our museum rather, and we periodically will put in temporary exhibits. And the one that we currently have now is on the Roosevelts, civil rights, and race. And it is our heaviest in terms of text and verbiage. It's one of our heaviest in terms of visual, and it's one of our heaviest in terms of topic as well. So it took over 2 years to plan. We had a whole committee of scholars who got together, and we talked about what we should have in it, what we shouldn't have in it, what do you include. And the problem is we only have 2,000 square feet in our exhibit. So there's a lot of stuff that's there that you can dig more deeply into if you're interested in doing that. But this will certainly whet your whistle and get your appetite going from there. So Martin Luther King once said very famously that the arc of history bends towards justice. And I think that is a great quote to use to describe the Roosevelt record on race. Because quite frankly, the Roosevelt record on race is mixed. Okay? It's a record that you can point to and say, wow, that was good that they did that. But it's also a record you can point to and say, wow, why didn't they do more about this? Or why didn't they do more about that? So tonight, my goal is not to make excuses for the Roosevelts, but to explain what was going on, explain what their thought processes were, explain where they made progress, and then you guys can come and take a look at the exhibit on your own and draw your own conclusions from there. Okay, and I'll take questions at the end so that we can make sure we get through everything the way we need to get it through. So, once upon a time, you go back to the beginning of the country, and the country had slavery. Right? We had enslaved people. And the Constitution, enshrines this with the 3/5 compromise. And so they kind of sweep the problem under the rug for a couple of generations, and then it all boils over with the Civil War, 1860 to 1865. And the North wins. I don't want to spoil it for anybody, but the North wins, and we end slavery in the country. And as a result of that, there were a whole bunch of people who had been enslaved but were now free. And as a result of the fact that Abraham Lincoln was a Republican who led the charge and led the war to end the Civil War and end slavery, many of the freed people, the enslaved people who were freed, decided to become Republicans in honor of Abraham Lincoln. And so the Republican Party had a great number of African American members from the end of the Civil War all the way on up to the 1920s. But by the 1920s, the African American community in the United States realized these Republicans really aren't doing anything for us. In fact, look what's happening after this war, right? We've got the Jim Crow laws. And the Jim Crow laws existed in this country, everywhere in the country. They were heaviest and most oppressive in the South. And there they were actually codified often into laws and procedures and those sorts of things. In the North, not so much codified in law, but certainly also still here in attitude. Okay, so many African Americans left the South after the Civil War in what came to be called the Great Migration. And this was where folks that had been living in the South said, this is land that we had to toil as slaves, and we don't want to be down here anymore. We're going to go different places. And of course, the Jim Crow laws made that even more convenient for them, right? Because they were they weren't enslaved anymore, but they were still being repressed. So as a result of the Great Migration, you get this big movement of African Americans from the South into the Northeast, into the North, and also into the West. And what this does over the course of about 5 decades or so is it begins to change the political dynamic in the country. Okay, it begins to change the political dynamic in the country. Now, by the 1930s, we have the Great Depression, 1929, the stock market crashes, and everybody says, oh, here's the Great Depression. It had actually started for farmers 10 years earlier, but that's a whole other discussion for a whole other day. And so what ends up happening is Franklin Roosevelt is going to run for president in 1932. Now it's interesting to know what the Roosevelt attitude toward African Americans was at the time. And basically, I think it might be best described as benign neglect. Right? The Roosevelts were wealthy. They were well connected. They were in the upper crust of American society, and they didn't come across too many African Americans. And the ones that they did were folks who worked for them and were being treated relatively well, right? Because they were working for the Roosevelts and such. So I'll pass around, here's a picture of the Roosevelts just to give you an idea of the kind of lifestyle that they were living. And it wasn't that they weren't turning their back on the problems of blacks in the country. They just really weren't aware. They just really weren't aware. It wasn't in their social system. So by 1932, when Franklin Roosevelt is running for election, I'll pass that around, he offers the country a new deal for the American people. And African Americans at this point had sort of run their course with Republicans. Very little was being done for them. And so there was a question of, well, maybe we'll give the Democrats a chance, or maybe we'll give them a try. And in the country, there was a thing called the Black Press. And this was a network of newspapers that went all across the country, and they were run and reported on and edited by black journalists. And the reason for this was because the white press wouldn't cover black events. Right? So they said, all right, we'll make our own press. And this was read by tens of thousands of people from one coast to the other. And what happened was that the black press began to pick up on this, this idea of a New Deal, a New Deal. I wonder what that means. Does that mean a New Deal for everybody, or does that mean a New Deal just for whites? And this guy here, it was a guy by the name of Robert Vann, and he was a prominent black press editor, and very influential among the black press across the country. And he advocated and said, you know what, let's give these Democrats a try. Right? Let's give Franklin Roosevelt a chance. Let's see what this New Deal can do for us. The Republicans haven't done much for us. You know, we got no other choice. Let's try this guy. Let's see what he can do for us. And so you can think of this guy, those of you that are young back there, as an influencer, right? As this guy goes, everybody else wants to go as well. So Robert Vann actually goes so far as to say, turn the picture of Lincoln's, turn the portrait of Lincoln to the wall, right? The debt has been paid. Okay, now we're going to try with the Democrats. So Robert Vann, very important fella there. And so the question was, what does the New Deal bring? Well, the New Deal was going to bring new jobs, it was going to bring new industries, it was going to bring new finance and such. And this says here, the Negro, of course that was the term used at the time, and this was based upon a political cartoon that appeared in the white press, which was this, and it says, it is a New Deal. And on here you have protection of gold, bank holiday, budget message, inaugural address, bank legislation. These were all things that Roosevelt was doing to get the country moving again, get some excitement going, get the, the industries working again. And the idea was, okay, what about for the Negro? And it was kind of a cute little play on the political cartoon from here to here. And what these folks in the black community were looking for was a man's chance to earn a living, full political recognition, justice, and equality. Right? That's what they were looking for from the New Deal. So I love those two cartoons because they kind of play off of each other. So Franklin Roosevelt runs for election, and pretty much any Democrat that ran for election in 1932 was going to win, because Herbert Hoover had pretty much been kicked to the curb at that point. And so the New Deal comes in, and the New Deal begins its New Deal programs. And inadvertently, it actually, in many cases, hurts African Americans. So many of the New Deal programs initially begin to have a negative effect on African Americans. And probably the one that was most indicative of this was the Agricultural Adjustment Act. Because the Agricultural Adjustment Act, right, so the 1920s, there's this big Dust Bowl, there's a huge agricultural problem. Roosevelt comes in, 40% of the country are farmers at that time. So if you're having major problems in your 40% of your economy, you've got some major problems going on. So he wants to address the problem with the farmers. And the way he's going to do this is through the Agricultural Adjustment Act. He's going to pay some farmers not to grow, right, to take some of their land out of production. And what that will do is it will bring less produce to the market and begin to raise the price of the produce, and thereby raise the income for the farmers. Well, this seems like a great idea, and it is a great idea if you are a white farmer. But the problem was that many of the people that were working on these farms tended to be people of color. And so what happened was, I'm a farmer, I'm a white farmer, I get the Agricultural Adjustment Act subsidy, and I say, okay, I'm going to take half of my land and I'm not going to farm it anymore. So what that means is, if you guys are all my farmers here, I'm going to leave half of you, I'm going to have to let go, because I'm not going to need you anymore. I'm not farming that land, right? I'm getting paid not to farm it, and I'm not going to pay you to sit around and do nothing. So hit the road and find someplace else to go. So it seemed like a great idea for farmers, actually had a detrimental impact on African Americans. And here is a group of folks heading out looking for work. Okay, and again, we're talking about 30–40% of the economy is farmers at this time. And so when you're impacting that number of people, you're having a huge impact down the line there as well. So the idea here is that Roosevelt's trying to help America, but he's inadvertently not helping African Americans. And yet they were a large group that helped to put him into office. So the black press says, hey, Robert Van, this guy was supposed to be helping us out here. What's going on? How come this isn't working? And so the black press begins to advocate for the New Deal to help out more African Americans, right? To do something, to fix these problems. And they begin to do that. Now another one of the programs that they did was the idea of creating loans for house ownership, home ownership and such, right? And so because the idea was if you owned a home, right, you're going to have an investment in that, you're going to be able to make some money over time as you sell that home, you're going to want to fill that home with stuff, right? Go home, look at your house, it's filled with stuff, right? And where'd you get that? From the store, you bought that stuff, right? So that helps the economy. So when you keep people in their homes or get people into homes, they're going to fill those homes with stuff that's going to help to generate the economy. Well, what ended up happening was the agencies that were responsible for that had some inherent racism in them. And so what they did was they began to draw maps. And they began to draw maps where people could get loans and people couldn't get loans. And if you tended to live in the white neighborhoods, or if you tended to want to move into the white neighborhood and were white, chances are you're going to get the loan. If you were an African American, maybe not so much, right? Or you're going to be sort of segregated out, right? De facto segregation. Now, not officially, right? But through the act of the way that these things were going on, that's the way it was happening. And I want to pass around this map. It's a little hard to see, but this is a map of Poughkeepsie. And we have this in our exhibit. And this is what you call a red line map, right? So there's certain neighborhoods where people are welcome, certain neighborhoods where people are not welcome. And through the loan structure of this, basically what you had was the ability to build up white neighborhoods and to not build up black neighborhoods. This has a huge impact on economic development for African Americans for generations, right? Because the whole idea of housing is you get in with a little house, you do what you can do, and then you sell that house and you trade up, right? And then you live there for a while and you trade up and then you eventually downsize, okay? When I first got married, we lived in Billings, right down the road here, in a little, 1,200 square foot house? 900. 900 square foot house. That's my neighbor. No, it's my wife. 900 square feet, right? So, and my father-in-law referred to it as the structure. Not even a house, but just the structure. How's things at the structure? But then we sold that house and bought a bigger house in Red Hook, and so you begin to build that up. And now our kids can't wait. They call up, hey, how you guys feeling? Oh, pretty good. Oh, okay. See if they're waiting to get the inheritance. So this has a huge impact for generations, right? Because it doesn't allow folks to get into the system to begin to be able to build up and to be able to move along that way. So Roosevelt hears this, and he begins to say, okay, well, that's not what I intended. It's not what I wanted. So we're going to be going about correcting some of this stuff. And by doing that, right, he's showing the black community, we do care about you guys, right? You guys came over here to, support us in the elections, and we're working for you. We're going to make things happen. We're going to, make things better for you. Now, one of the important programs, one of the most important programs in the New Deal was a thing called the WPA, right, the Works Progress Administration. And before there was a Works Progress Administration, there was a Public Works Administration. And the difference is this: the Public Works Administration came first. And what that was the government paid private companies to build things. All right, so I come in on the government and say, okay, you guys are construction people, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to make loans available to you. You guys are going to go out there, you're going to build stuff. And you go out and you build stuff, and you hire whoever you want. And guess who's getting hired, and guess who's not getting hired, right? So this was one of the ways that the Roosevelt administration sort of turned course, and then they created the Works Progress Administration, the WPA. And what that did was it paid people directly. Okay, so the government was kind of coming up with the programs and paying the people directly. The government was doing the hiring. It wasn't leaving it up to individual companies to do that, where they could hire whoever they wanted or not. Once you were getting money through the WPA, then you were encouraged to hire African Americans. And this was a huge step forward for work for African Americans, right? For the ability to get skills, for the ability to have a decent paycheck, and for the ability to feel like they're contributing, right? They're building something, they're making something, right? They're really coming into the system. So this is how this begins to take place. Now, this doesn't happen in a vacuum. Okay, Roosevelt is very much a politician, and he will tend to respond to things when he feels the political pressure. Now, obviously, he was a great leader, right? I don't think anybody would dispute that. But there were times when he didn't jump to the front of the leadership line, but he kind of lagged behind, waiting until he was pushed to do something or forced to do something. And usually, who do you think was the person pushing him to do something?
Eleanor.
Eleanor, right, okay, Eleanor. So here's what happens with Eleanor. Eleanor gets it. She gets it by 1934. She understands how African Americans are living in the country. She understands how they're being subjugated to poor housing, to poor education, to poor employment, poor health care and all that. And part of the reason for that is the president is in Washington. He's working on trying to get the economy moving again. He's got polio, so it's difficult for him to travel around. And so what he ends up doing is he sends Eleanor out there on fact-finding missions. Go on out there and see what's happening, right? And he trained her. He said, if you're going to go to Millbrook, 5 minutes before you get to Millbrook, well, obviously not Millbrook, but like, let's say she was traveling someplace by train, right? Detroit, let's say, okay, because she would drive to Millbrook. But let's say she's going to Detroit. He would say, 5 minutes before you get to Detroit, have the conductor tell you, 5 minutes out from Detroit, Mrs. Roosevelt, and start taking a look out the windows. What do you see? How are things? Right? Because you're first lady, they're going to take you to the fanciest, schmanciest places in town. They're going to take you to the places where everything's been scrubbed and cleaned and painted and all the rest of that, and that's not going to give you a fair impression of what it's like really in Detroit. What do you see on the train 5 minutes in? What do you see on the train 5 minutes out? What kinds of conditions are the houses in? What kinds of clothes are the children wearing? What kinds of toys are they playing with? How many buildings are boarded up? Right? That's going to give you a better idea of what's going on. And he even went down to the level where he said, if you go to a soup kitchen and they tell you that they're serving gumbo, stick your nose in the pot and make sure it's not oatmeal, because we're paying for gumbo. We're not paying for oatmeal. And so what happens is, hi guys, so what happens is Mrs. Roosevelt sees this firsthand all across the country, and by 1934, she's convinced we're not treating people right, we have to address this. So she begins to bring this back to the president, and she begins to advocate for better programming, better funding, and more opportunity for African Americans. And FDR trusts her, right? He trusts her judgment, and so he begins to make sure this becomes more and more part of the administration. There were other people in the administration, people like Francis Perkins, people like Harold Ickes, who were also very proactive in helping African Americans get better treatment and such. But Mrs. Roosevelt is, she's the one right there in the house every day, with the president's ear moving things along. So one of the things that President Roosevelt does is he appoints more African Americans than any other president into federal service up to that time. Okay, so he says, okay, we're going to have some African Americans in the Labor Department, and we're going to have some in agriculture, we're going to have some in finance, we're going to have some in foreign policy, and we're going to, begin to put folks into these places, so we'll hear the African American voice in the government, and they'll have a voice and be able to shape the way things are going and the way things we're going to do, the way we're going to do things. And so this is a big step forward as well, because now people are listening. But the problem is they're spread out all over the place. And it's kind of like if you take your finger and you poke somebody, right, it's kind of annoying, right, and it's, it hurts. But if you take your fist and you put it all together, now you've got some real power, right? Now you've got some real influence. So there's a woman by the name of Mary Bethune, and she is appointed into the government. She happens to be friends with Eleanor Roosevelt. She's an educator, and she gets into the government, and she says, hey, you know what? There's a lot of us in the government now. There's a lot of us in here, and we have a lot of little pointers everywhere. But let's pull together, and let's really make some power, right? Let's really put some power forth. And this is a picture of her with Mrs. Roosevelt. So you can see their buds. Okay, and she is credited with creating what's called the Black Cabinet. All right, now there's not really a Black Cabinet that meets, like, every Thursday or something like, like a cabinet would. But what the Black Cabinet does is she begins to meet with these representatives in the Black community in the government, and she says, you know what, let's all start talking with one voice. Let's put that power together. Let's make a fist as opposed to all of those pointers. And so this becomes what's called the Black Cabinet. And what it does is it magnifies the African American voice in the administration, and again, the administration begins to respond. Now, about this time, there is a call for an anti-lynching bill. Okay, lynching is a huge problem, not just in the South, all across the country. And so there's this movement, this push to have an anti-lynching bill. And Mrs. Roosevelt comes out in support of it, and the president will not come out in support of it. And he says, listen, you can say whatever you want, Eleanor. You can do whatever you want. I'm going to go out there, advocate, do whatever you got to do. I can't do it. Because if I do, I will lose the support of Southern Democrats in the Congress. Okay? And if I'm going to pass anything, I need to have the support of those Southern Democrats. Now, and Roosevelt, it wasn't like just, leaving it out there. He said, lynching is murder. And there's laws against murder. And there's laws against murder in every town and village and state in the country. So when there's a lynching, it can be handled locally as a murder. Yes, it could, but who's running the sheriff's department? Right? Who's running the state police? Okay? Are you really getting justice? And of course the answer is not really. But Roosevelt cannot come out for the anti-lynching bill, because he feels he's going to undermine his political support. Now, you could argue this. You could criticize him for that. Many people did. Many people still do. But I want to give you a little picture of what he's up against. And it's interesting because if I had said this, made this argument, let's say a year or two ago, it would have been, harder to convince people. But if you look at our current government, right, and I'm not getting political here, okay, because I'm on the clock. You want to talk to me later, that's another story. But I'm not getting political here. But look how just a small handful of people in the Congress have been able to gum everything up, right, to prevent things from happening, to prevent things from going. We're down now to maybe a vote or two here or there. It makes a huge difference in policy. So when you come to and I'll pass this around, I think, I'll pass it around if I have one. I'll pass this around. You can't really see it that well, but what this is here's a picture of the Black Press, the Black Cabinet, right? Some of the folks that are there for that. Okay, so now they're moving through. And I think I printed it out. Let me just take a peek here. Talk amongst yourselves. Nudge the person next to you and say, isn't he doing a great job? Let's see here. Hold on. There we go. All right. You can't make it out that well, but you'll get an idea. Come to the library, you'll see this in living color and in full length. So what this is the Southern Democrats are controlling the Congress, right? And this is a result, coming in after the Civil War. So while Roosevelt is president, we have in the House, we have 4 speakers over the course of the time, and they're all Southern white Democrats. And the Southern white Democrats control the following committees in the House. They control them. Okay, so they're the ones that are deciding what gets done, what doesn't get done. They control the judiciary, agriculture, military affairs, ways and means, banking and currency, appropriations, interstate and foreign commerce, the Rules Committee, and foreign affairs. So that's in the House. This is what Roosevelt's up against. Over in the Senate, there are two Southern Democrats who serve as majority leaders during Roosevelt's term, and there the committees are dominated by Southern Democrats in finance, foreign relations, military affairs, agriculture and forestry, commerce, rules, judiciary, banking and currency, naval affairs, and also appropriations. Okay. So again, I'm not making an excuse for Roosevelt, but he's weighing out his options, okay? So if I want to get New Deal legislation passed, if I want to get reelected, if I want to get things done, and I annoy these guys, if I PO these guys, then guess what? Nothing's going to happen. So he has to make haste slowly. He has to make haste where he can. And the way he can do that is to switch up the WPA and begin to hire blacks that way. Yeah. What he can do is he can appoint more African Americans into appointed government positions and such. And that's exactly what he ends up doing. Now, he gets reelected. Well, not yet, but he runs for re-election in 1936. Now, 1936 is the absolute first time that either of the two major political parties, Democrats or Republicans, have African American delegates at the convention. Very first time ever. It's the 1936 Democratic Convention. There are 10 African American delegates. All right, not a huge number, but 10. And what happens is they get there, and there's one African American congressman at the time in the country. He addresses the convention, and a reverend from Philadelphia gives the convocation at the convention. And this infuriates the Southern delegations. In fact, many of them walk out. Okay, they absolutely walk out. And Roosevelt doesn't do anything about this, because what he understands is, you know what? The African American population has joined the Democratic Party. And if you don't like it, there's the door, right? This represents the future, right? This represents where we're going to go. And, it may not seem like a lot, 10 delegates, out of hundreds. It may not seem like a lot, that two people of color address the convention and such. But this is huge. This is the first time ever this stuff has happened. And so now the Democratic coalition has the African American vote. And as they are voting more for Democrats, it gives President Roosevelt a little bit more power to begin to move things in the appropriate direction. One of the things he does is he appoints Mary Bethune to be the head of the National Youth Administration, which was a huge, she was the #1 highest ranking African American official in the government at that time. And that was a huge organization for helping black youth get job skill training and job skills so that they would then have the ability to compete for jobs and such. So, he's beginning to move in this direction. He's beginning to go through that way. Now, at the same time, we've got a young woman by the name of Marian Anderson. Everybody's heard of Marian Anderson, right? And she happened to be a fantastic singer, but she also happened to be an African American. And she was supposed to give a concert at Constitution Hall in Washington, D.C. in February of 1939. And they wouldn't let her sing there because she's black. So like, well, sorry, it's a segregated city. We don't allow, black singers to sing here, to white audiences and stuff. So sorry, you're not going to be able to do that. Well, Mary Anderson happens to be good buddies with Eleanor Roosevelt, right? So Eleanor Roosevelt gets wind of this. She says, what the heck, that's not right, She says, your voice doesn't have a color, it has a tone, has a tenor, has a quality, but it doesn't have a color. And so what she does is she resigns her membership in an organization called the DAR, the Daughters of the American Revolution, who were sponsoring the concert. Okay, they were sponsoring the concert. So she says, this isn't right. I'm going to, make a public stand here. And she resigns her membership in the DAR. Well, the concert goes on without Eleanor Roosevelt. 6 weeks later, on Easter Sunday, there is a concert on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. 75,000 people show up. Guess who's singing? Marian Anderson, right? So she gets her due, right? I get goosebumps when I say that, right? I mean, good for her, right? So there she is, on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, Abraham Lincoln, the man who ended slavery, back there, African-American singer, singing to a crowd of 75,000 black and white spectators, and a very important person had been invited, but decided she wouldn't go. And who do you think that was? It's going to surprise you. Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt said, you know what, thanks, I'm not going. I'm not going to go to the concert, even though she's buddies with Marian Anderson. Anybody know why? This is my favorite Eleanor Roosevelt story. Because when Eleanor Roosevelt was married on March 17th in 1905, her parents had both died by then, so she asked her uncle, Uncle Teddy, to walk her down the aisle at her wedding. Uncle Teddy happened to be president. Uncle Teddy was one of those guys that wanted to be the bride at every wedding, you know, the corpse at every funeral, and the baby at every christening, right? This guy loved attention. And so on her wedding day, when she should have been, right, the main event, everybody was paying attention to Uncle Teddy. And that was March 17, 1905. Now fast forward to Easter Sunday, 1939, and Eleanor Roosevelt knows, if I go, it's going to be Eleanor Roosevelt, First Lady of the United States, attends concert for some African American. And she knows Marian Anderson's not going to get her moment in the sun. And so she stays home and gives Marian Anderson the stage that she absolutely and totally deserves. So that's one of the more known highlights. So what we have is the Roosevelts early on just kind of oblivious to any kind of problems. They're living their, you know, fancy lifestyle and everything. He decides he's going to run for president. African Americans are disenfranchised with what the Republicans have done. The black press is beginning to say, well, you know, we got to do something here. How about we throw our support behind President Roosevelt, the guy who wants to be President Roosevelt, and Robert Vann, a big influencer, you know, presses the black press to do this. They jump over to the Democratic side. Roosevelt gets elected. Roosevelt creates the New Deal programs. At first, they're not helping blacks. In many cases, they're hurting them. He then responds by twisting things around a little bit and beginning to turn back some of that. They respond back to that. And he ends up having to do this balancing walk all the time between pushing for things to move forward, but at the same time, not alienating the Southern white Democrats because they control the Congress. They control what's going to be able to get out there to be voted on. By 1936, blacks have proven themselves loyal Democrats, and Democrats have proven themselves to be effective in trying to support black movement and black advancing and such. So things are going pretty well. Throughout the second term, continues to go well. Then 1939 rolls around, and so everybody's with me so far, right? Okay, so now 1939 comes along, and you got Hitler over in Europe, right? So he starts the Second World War on September 1st, 1939. We don't get into it till December 7th, 1941. And what Hitler begins to do is he begins to try to take over the world. He begins to murder people simply because of who they are. He claims that the Nazis are a master race. And anybody that doesn't fit his criteria of who belongs gets eliminated. Okay, so he is, running a race war, basically, right? Yes, it's about power. Yes, it's about money and aggression, but it's fundamentally about we're the master race, and you guys are shouldn't exist, or if you do exist to serve us. So on December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor, we get dragged into the war against Japan. 3 days later, Hitler declares war on the United States. Now we're in a two-front war, and what happens is African Americans come to the forefront and say, hey, we want to serve, we want to go out there, we want to, sign us up, where do we go, what do we do, how does this work? And they say, well, gee, thanks everybody, that's great, but you're going to do we'll put you in carpool and KP. All right, how's that? You guys can do that kind of stuff. We're not going to put you in, fighting regiments and that sort of stuff. And this is all based upon a 1925 Army War College report that was drawn up by the Army War College in 1925 that was based on purely bogus science, right? That African Americans weren't qualified to fight. They weren't qualified to be in the military. And of course, African Americans had served in every conflict we had from the Revolution all the way on up through the First World War. So they were saying, hey, we can do this, you know, we got this, we can do this. And the Army was holding them back, And so, come on in, you want to come in, drive the cars, you know, cut the potatoes, that's great, but that's all we're going to have. And so now what happens is this parallel develops. It's like, wait a minute, we're fighting a racist in Europe, and we're not allowing people with dark skin to fight for us here, right? This is a form of racism, just like that's a form of racism. We are fighting against what we're perpetrating right here. So, again, Roosevelt, now he's running for election in 1940. So 1940 comes along, and he needs to have black support again. But by now, some of the black support, you know, the Democrats have kind of gotten a little bit lazy with that. So now they've been kind of neglecting, you know, we got your some initial good first stuff, you guys. But now, you know, we got other fish to fry and all that. So what happens is the Republicans come back and they begin to court the black vote. Wendell Willkie, you know, very popular among African Americans. So Roosevelt has to do something. And he's got a big problem on his hands because it's 1940, nobody's ever run, actually that's true, Teddy Roosevelt ran for a third term, but it's breaking the third term tradition. And, you know, people go, oh, should he do it, shouldn't he do it? You know, 2 terms was good enough for Washington. You know, who does this guy think he is? So he's got to shore up all the support that he can. A couple of months before the election, his press secretary, Steve Early, is in New York and gets in a scuffle with a black police officer. And the black press is like, whoa, what's this all about, right? And they play it up all across the black press. So now FDR's got a real problem going on here, right? He's already kind of wobbly in some of the black support. So what he does is he appoints a black general to be a brigadier general. For the first, I'm not far from those air guys. I'm going to go over and see what they're all about. So she goes over and she says, hey, you know, I hear about you guys, you know, this is great, da-da-da. And she gets there and she notices, wow, you know what? Their barracks are in kind of bad shape compared to these barracks. Oh, their planes are in kind of bad shape compared to these planes. Their equipment is in kind of bad shape compared to this equipment. And basically what happened was the Army Air Corps said, all right, you guys can come in, but we ain't helping you. Right? You know, we're going to give you the crappiest stuff, the lousiest stuff, and you make, you know, see what you can do. You know, they're basically trying to set them up for failure. So Mrs. Roosevelt goes, she's, I don't know. So she's talking to these guys, and this guy, Colonel Anderson, they call him Chief, he was the top African-American aviator at the time, who was there training the other black pilots. And he says, well, Mrs. Roosevelt, the best way I can probably show you how to do this, how we're doing down here, is to take you for a flight. You want to go? And she said, I'd love to. So she hops in the plane, right? Now the Secret Service is like, oh my God, wait a minute, well, you can't do that. According to the Army War College report of 1925, these guys can only peel potatoes and that. She gets in the plane and off she goes, right? And they fly around for 20, 25 minutes, Chief Anderson, and they come back down, and she lands, and this picture is taken. Colonel Anderson over here, Mrs. Roosevelt there. She is absolutely delighted. Right? And she gets out of the plane, she goes, these fellows can fly just as well as anybody. Huge step forward for African-American aviators. Mrs. Roosevelt knew her flying. One of her close personal friends, Amelia Earhart. Right? Now Amelia Earhart is, of course, you know, known for the most famous flight, which was her last. But before that, there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of successful flights. And Mrs. Roosevelt would sometimes fly with her. And so she knew good flying. And these guys were doing good flying. And so this was a huge step forward for African-American aviation as well. So Roosevelt wins the 1940 election. And now, you know, things are looking good for African Americans. So civil rights leaders, Philip Randolph and Walter White go to the White House, and they meet with President Roosevelt in a meeting in the White House in the Oval Office, and they begin to push, saying, okay, listen, let's really get us guys in here. Let's really make this happen. And excuse me, Roosevelt says, well, yeah, I guess, that's here. He's like, well, what about if, we'll make some room for you guys. That's what we'll do. We'll make some room. And so he allows African Americans now to join the band in the Army, the band in the Navy, right? So you don't have to just be KP and carpool. You want to be in the band, you can be in the band. You want to do a little bit of, security work, you can do that, right? So little teeny weeny little steps. And these guys are pushing for full integration. So Roosevelt says, well, let me think about it and I'll get back to you. And they're all good, right? So they leave feeling pretty good. Like, wow, all right, we're making some progress. And then once they leave, Roosevelt doesn't do anything about it. Okay, doesn't do anything about it. So now, these guys are like, any day now he's going to say something, right? Any day he's going to, you just wait, right? Any minute now, it's going to happen, it's going to happen, it's going to happen. Doesn't happen. In fact, Steve Early, let me see if I can find the exact quote here. Basically, Steve Early issues a press release that says, no, we're not going to integrate, we're not going to, do anything. I'm paraphrasing. And so what ends up happening is these guys are like, wait a minute, we were in there, you told us we were going to do something, you were going to do something, and now your press secretary is saying you're not going to do anything. So they backpedal and was like, oh no, we're going to do stuff. It's going to happen, right? And now these guys feel like they've been double-crossed. So what they do is they plan a march on Washington. And they plan this March on Washington movement. And they expect to maybe be able to get 100,000 people to come and march on Washington, D.C. In support of offering up bigger opportunities for African Americans in the military. And President Roosevelt hears about this and he sends Eleanor. He says, Eleanor, get up there to New York and talk these guys out of it. All right? So she goes up to New York and she goes, now listen guys, this is essentially not, she didn't really say this, but she's basically, listen guys, the president sent me here to talk you out of this, so don't do it. And then they say, we're going to do it. And she's like, all right, well, I tried, right? What can I tell you? Okay. So she goes back to Washington and she says, they're going to do it. They're going to make this happen. They're going to do this. So, be prepared. Now, Roosevelt, and I'll pass that around to you. Roosevelt, of course, has his hands full now, right? Wait, we're in a two-front war, right? I can't be having a march on Washington. This is going to draw more attention to the race issue. And I just can't have this. I just cannot have this. So what he ends up doing is he issues an executive order. Executive Order 8802. And Executive Order 8802 is the order that desegregates the defense industries. Not the military, but the defense industries. Now this is a big deal because by this point, right, 1940, 1941, 1942, 90% of the economy is defense, right, because we're in the war, right? We are the arsenal democracy. We're making this stuff, we're using all that New Deal infrastructure to build the tanks and the planes and the bullets and the Band-Aids and all the rest of that sort of stuff. But African Americans are kept out of those jobs. So, but with Executive Order 8802, what Roosevelt does is he allows for integration in the defense industries. This is a huge step forward for African Americans in terms of employment. The defense industries pay more. They're 90% of the economy at this point. Right? So lots and lots of jobs. You don't like making airplanes, you can always make a tank. You don't like making a tank, go make a tent. Right? There's lots of stuff you can do across the board here. And you're going to make more money, and you're going to actually be trained to do stuff, right? Because the jobs we need for you guys to do are going to be skilled jobs. So now you're going to learn skills, make more money, and have more opportunity. Big step forward. And of course, this is the summer of '43 that this comes through, and it's fully integrated. And what happens is there's riots all over the country, right? Oh, we're not going to work with those people, blah, 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 blah. And so over the summertime, there's riots all over the country, but Roosevelt doesn't do anything. He doesn't issue a statement, he doesn't, intervene, he just lets it happen, right? And he's hoping that, people are just gonna have to come to this on their own terms, in their own time and how they, about their own way, and that's what they end up doing. But not without violence first. And of course, who speaks out against this stuff? Mrs. Roosevelt, right? So he's able to use her in a way as kind of a foil, right? I can't do it, I can't say it because, I'm official, I'm the president, and I don't want to, get those Southern Democrats mad. But he lets Eleanor do this. And he had a way of handling Mrs. Roosevelt. And it was one sentence. And the sentence was, well, that's my Eleanor. That's the statement. Well, that's my Eleanor. And if she did something that worked out well for him and played well for him, he'd say, well, that's my Eleanor. But if she did something that didn't work out and created political heat for him, he'd say, well, that's my Eleanor. Right? And he was then able to either embrace what she was doing or push off what she was doing and keep the political space that he needed in order to get the things that he wanted to get done. Okay? So that's the way this begins to work, and these guys begin to get into these industries and things. They are still not integrated into the military, although there are these small experiments like the Tuskegee Airmen, the Black Panther tank movement and those kinds of folks. And then, of course, on April 12, 1945, Franklin Roosevelt dies. And in comes Harry Truman. Harry Truman needs Eleanor Roosevelt because nobody even knows who the hell Harry Truman is. He was vice president for 83 days. Okay? In fact, when the Secretary Stimson, 2 days into the administration, President Truman says, oh, we're going to do blah, blah, we're going to do this, so make sure we do this, right? And Stimson says, oh, did the president make that decision before he died? And Truman said, no, he made it right now. Remember, I'm president? Yeah, sorry, I forgot about that. Sorry about that, right? He really needed Eleanor Roosevelt. And Eleanor Roosevelt, he embraced her, she embraced him, and he continued on the policies, with a little bit of pressure from Mrs. Roosevelt, to begin to loosen up on the segregation and loosen up on the position to advance situations for African Americans. In fact, he is the guy building upon the 8802 executive order desegregating the defense industries. He's able to completely integrate the military in like 1947 or 1948, something like that. So he gives that executive order. And what you're seeing here is this slow beginning movement in that direction. Mrs. Roosevelt then goes on to become a powerhouse in Democratic politics. So she pushes Truman to continue this. She pushes Adlai Stevenson, who running for president 3 times, never wins, but nonetheless she supports him because he's very proactive on this sort of thing. And then when John F. Kennedy becomes president, she again holds his feet to the fire. In fact, there was a meeting in the summer of 1960. He came to Hyde Park supposedly to give a talk on the 25th anniversary of the creation of Social Security, but he was really here to basically suck up to Mrs. Roosevelt and get her support for the presidency. Well, here's a story that people don't know. So they meet at her little house, Val Kill. But the night before the meeting, Mrs. Roosevelt gets a phone call from a camp upstate New York. Her granddaughter's up there. And so Mrs. Roosevelt, we have terrible news. Your granddaughter was injured in a horse riding accident this afternoon. And she's in pretty bad shape. Now, the little girl's parents were up in Maine, so Eleanor was the closest Roosevelt relative to the camp up in Utica. So she hops in the car, gets a state police escort up to Utica. She gets up there, she sits with the little girl. Over the course of the night, the little girl dies. Yeah. So Mrs. Roosevelt says, well, there's nothing I can do. Right? She's gone. Her parents are on the way. I've got to meet with Senator Kennedy in the morning. Police escort back down to Hyde Park, and she meets with John F. Kennedy the next morning at Val Kill. When he finds out, he's like, oh, we'll have to reschedule. Don't worry about that. We'll find some other time. That's my Jack Kennedy in town. I probably sound more like him now than he does. But anyway, so the way it works is she comes down and she pushes she holds his feet to the fire. And it's in that meeting that she gets him to say, she says, I'll support you, but I want these planks in the Democratic platform. I want housing and, jobs, and I want, movement for African Americans, and voting rights, right? And these are not passed during President Kennedy's lifetime because he's assassinated, but Lyndon Johnson picks them up afterwards and passes those, but they were part of the platform because Eleanor Roosevelt insisted that they be, at that time. So what you see, in the course of history here is that the Roosevelts kind of laid the foundation. You hear a lot about, civil rights in the 50s and the 60s, but those ideas of the marches and the movements have the roots back during the Roosevelt administration. The idea of the passing of the legislation, the baby steps, the making the small steps of progress where you can and letting things begin to move along as best you can, begin in the Roosevelt administration. Right? And for some people, this is a great thing, right? Like, oh, that's good, we're making progress. For other folks, it's like, hey, it's not happening fast enough, right? But and Eleanor Roosevelt was an early supporter of none other than Martin Luther King. In fact, she had a television show at the time. It was like a kind of Meet the Press Sunday morning show, and she booked him to be on that show, but she passed away before he was able to come on to the show. So the foundation for the movements, the foundation for the legislation, the foundation for bringing African Americans into the Democratic Party as part of the Democratic coalition, all of that comes about through the Roosevelt era. Could he have been more forceful on things? Could he have desegregated the military? He had the power to do that. He was a commander-in-chief. He could have said, hey, from here on in, babies, here's how it's going to happen. But he couldn't do it, he felt, because of the political reality at the time. So he, half a loaf is better than none. I'll let you guys into the jobs. Can't let you into the Army. Can't put you directly in the Army, but we'll start this experiment over here, the Tuskegee Airmen, and see how you guys do. And you know how they did? 92% success rate in the bombers that they protected. So this is the thing here. Now we still do have some of the residual problems, right? If you take a look at some of the economic problems, some of those stem directly from the redlining that took place in those initial funding for housing and those sorts of things. Okay, so we do have some work to do. And I think the moral of the story is that if you have the desire to make things happen, you can make things happen. It's not going to happen quick. It's not going to happen easy. There has to be compromise. There has to be balance. But you can begin to make those movements. And by building on small steps, by building on the foundation, you can begin to go up from there. But in order to do that, you must learn from your mistakes, see what worked and what didn't work, correct for those things, and you cannot sit back and coast. Because when you coast, you lose traction, you lose ground. Right? Every time people say, oh yeah, we got it, we fixed it, everything's good now, and it ain't. Right? And it slips back, and now it's like, oh, we got to begin to do this stuff again. And so that's the Roosevelt record on civil rights and race. Questions, comments, snide remarks? Really? No? Oh, yes. Thank you. Yes.
Were the Jim Crow laws just about segregation, or did they encompass anything else?
It was mostly oppression. Segregation was part of that. You live over here, we live over there. But excuse me. But it also had to do with employment, had to do with housing, had to do with opportunities for education and those sorts of things. And they manifest themselves in different ways. Like there might be poll taxes. So, oh yeah, you're welcome to come and vote, but it's going to cost you $25 processing fee. Well, I don't have $25. Wow, that's too bad. Sorry about that. Oh, you're welcome to vote. There's no fee here, but could your grandfather vote? Oh, my grandfather was an enslaved person. Oh, sorry. So there was all these sorts of things. And it was heaviest in the South. All right, it was heaviest in the South, but it still existed in the North. But it was less in the North. There was more opportunity. There was more social mobility, let's say, in the North. But it was everywhere.
But there was still a lot of segregation in the North.
Oh, yeah, yeah,
I
absolutely.
mean, schools and.
Yep, schools, exactly, right. But again, heavily in the south, sort of de facto-y in the north, you know. It's like nobody told you to draw a line down the middle of this, but just the way the loans are happening, you know, there was lines down the middle of it, just the way the loans are happening, you know, you guys live over there, we live over here. So there was, you know, there's inherent racism in a lot of this stuff. You know, the Army War College report, right? That was billed as an opportunity to professionalize the military. All right, because prior to that, you know, you would create your own little local militia, offer yourself up to the government and fight. Right now, no, we're going to have real live divisions like we saw over in the First World War. We're going to do that over here. And you know, while we're at it, this is an opportunity to push Alexis on, right? And that's, you know, that's what ended up happening. So, yeah. And does anyone know where Jim Crow comes from? It was actually, Jim Crow was a character, actually a caricature, of African Americans in minstrel shows back in the 1830s through the 1850s. So that's where the term comes from. So next time you're playing Trivial Pursuit, and you get that one right.
Yes.
Anything else? Okey-dokey. So I'll tell you what, thank you so much for coming out on a cold, frosty winter night. Please come to the exhibit. You know, if you were interested in any of this, you're going to find the exhibit way more interesting than me. Not loud. Or it's cute, but very informative if you get there as well. So please come.
Until when?
Until December 31st of this year. So you got plenty of time, but don't put it off because you know what'll happen. You'll put it off, and you won't get there. Great.
Three things really quick. First, a plug for our March program, which is a talk about a guy named Benson Lawson, who is not that famous today, but in the 19th century was really famous. He was a historian who wrote about the American Revolution, he wrote about the Civil War, which he lived through. And the guy who's giving the talk lives in his house, which is kind of on the edge of the town of Washington and the town of Dover, up on Chestnut Ridge. He was born in Beekman, I think. He's a local guy, right, Dutchess County guy, and was very famous in his day. And so the guy's going to talk about Lossing, but also his house that he restored. He invited me to come see his house. It's really lovely, so you'll enjoy the pictures of it. So that's the first thing. The second thing, I made brownies. If people want brownies, they have mint frosting on them. It's going to taste like, you know, you're brushing your teeth really eating them. It's intense mint flavor, but have some of those. And once again, let's thank Jeff for
Just make sure we get those pictures.